Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about what's new in VeeValidate v4. So like Jerry introduced me, I am Abdelrahman Awad, a front-end engineer at Robusta Studio. You can follow me on Twitter at this handler. And this is a QR code for my website. I published some Vue articles here and there. And I created VeeValidate. So I am probably unironically the best guy to talk to you about this today. So let's get started. So I'm sure most of you, if not, well, some of you, if not most, are using VeeValidate already. So what may be the reasons for you to be using it? So first, it is most popular at the moment, which is another word to say it is just the oldest. It just came first and stay maintained long enough for it to be, well, ahead in terms of popularity. So I'm sure VeeValidate and other libraries would have been in the same spot if they came out earlier, but here we are. It is also follows something called the declarative style of doing form validation. So you have these two styles. You have declarative and you have imperative. Declarative being a fancy word to say, I'm doing validation in the template, in the HTML or markup. Imperative, you are doing it in the script, in your JavaScript. We also, VeeValidate has also built-in rules, which means you get this whole package of rules you can use immediately in your applications without having to resort to anything external, which is nice because you don't have to reach out or shop for libraries to get your validators from. And it also has support for error messages and localization out of the box for you as well. So this whole package neatly packed up for you allows you to do so much stuff right at the start without having to do a lot of setup or boilerplate. But there are some problems. So let's go a little back in history and compare VeeValidate v2 versus v3, which it was about last year. So in v2, VeeValidate started as a simple directive. You just say VeeValidate and you give it the rules to validate it, and you just put it on your inputs, and it will just work out of the box for you. And it's funny now, but this is the reason why VeeValidate was called VeeValidate, because it was just a pronunciation for the VeeValidate directive. Now it's kind of ironic because we no longer have the directive, but we do have the validation provider higher order component, which uses scoped slots. And as you can see, it's not that nicer. You might argue that v2 is actually much better than v3, but there are a few reasons for that. First, directives in Vue are stateless, meaning, well, they started in Vue 1, they had a lot of stuff going on with them. They had props, they had this instance, and they had, it just means I could do a lot of stuff on the directives. In Vue, when Vue 2 came out, they changed that and removed the props, and they removed this instance. It's no longer an instance, so you can no longer store your data on it. So some stuff like error messages must be placed somewhere else, which meant I had to implement a workaround for this when Vue 2 came out, and I had to implement a state management system around stateless directives, which isn't something I'm proud of. It was like too much code for something so little of value. Also, directives are mostly ideal for only read-only operations. You shouldn't do a lot of writing in your directives. It should only affect either the element or the binding of that element, but you shouldn't really try to do crazy stuff with it. But VeeValidate did those crazy stuff. It was actually, I'm actually amazed how it built all this validation logic on just a directive. So, and just to give you how crazy it was, I think at some point VeeValidate broke the Vue DevTools, and Archium was very mad at me, and we had to resolve it. So yeah, it was kind of crazy. Also, directives don't have access to the render logic, meaning directives can't really tell how the tree looks like. They only have access to the DOM. And in Vue 3, they will become even more limited. So they will no longer even be able to access the context component, which means it lost lots of their capabilities, which means that directive would have been deprecated either then or now. It would have to go. So I think I got really lucky by deprecating it early, so we don't have to suffer with. I might as well create just another library if I had to do all those breaking changes right now. So let's check the current problems with VeeValidate. As both the library maintainer and a user of this library, I get the benefit of watching too many issues being created on GitHub, and since I'm the one answering them, I get to understand what people are finding difficulties with. So first off, we start with the learning curve. The learning curve of VeeValidate is slightly weird now. Previously with V2, it was much easier to get started with, but it was really hard to get anything advanced with it. Like if you had this really complex forum, it would just break and would require tons of workarounds to get it to work. Right now, it's slightly harder, or well, let's not put it lightly. It's really hard to get your first validation going on, but it rewards you down the road that much harder stuff, much complicated forms are much easier to build later on. But it's kind of weird. It's not that it's still hard and not hard. So I would like to tackle that, and we'll see that in a minute. So it is also slow. So VeeValidate, while fast enough, which is a trademark here, fast enough for your applications, you won't even notice that it's slow. But as its maintainer, and since I wrote the actual code, I know for a fact it is slow. It does lots of overheads just between re-renders just to get validation working, which is something I really want to avoid. Also, because we went from V2 to V3, and the real difference between them was just the deprecation of the vee-validate directive. That means it wasn't really an upgrade from V2. It was just less code than V2, which meant I missed a lot of opportunities here to introduce some newer changes or radical changes. So yeah, some regrets here. Also, as you probably saw from the previous slide, it is verbose by default. You write a lot of code just to get validation working, which isn't something I'm proud of as well. So I hope we try to fix that in the upcoming slides. So let's list our goals here for V4. I would like to support Vue 3, of course. It's coming right around the corner. I'm not sure when, but when it's ready, I guess, but soon. And I would like to give you guys all a better developer experience when working with VeeValidate or form validation in general. So my ultimate goal here is to allow you guys to build faster forums faster. So let's see if we can understand how we could do that. So in my career, I have built tons of forums. In my previous job, I built almost exclusively worked on building dashboards with tons of forums. And I have a lot of insight from that experience, but I never actually used it. But here are the most lessons, and you might find them even obvious to you, but I don't think I have ever taken advantage of these insights. So 80% of your forums do not process their values until they are submitted. Meaning, when you define your inputs like an email, a password, and a name field, and they all start with an empty string, you don't actually care what the current value of them until they are submitted. So you can submit them to your server or do whatever you want. You don't care between interactions about their value. We will see an example for this in the very next slide, but keep that in mind. Most of your forums use simple inputs. You are more likely to use a text field, a select field, a radio button than using something really complicated like a date picker or a component library like Vuetify. While they are very common and very popular, you are more likely to use native HTML inputs. So that meant I have something here that I could make some people's lives easier here. And also your forums are always validated before submission. So yeah, that's the whole point, I think. So let's see if we can make all of this easier or take those insights into our advantage. So this is what I call by redundant model. So we define our model here. We have the data property here, we define our name, email, and password, and they all start with an empty string. And we just define them so we can bind them to our inputs. So we can always have access to them. But most of the time, we don't really access them until they are submitted. So these are redundant. It would be great if we could remove them, right? It would make our forms much more less code to write. And here, from my perspective, we still have to write, even though we are declaratively writing a form up there in the template, we are still imperatively defining their values. So if we could completely make this declarative or completely make this imperative, it would be much easier for both ways, for both. Either if you use VeeValidate or any other library, it would be beneficial for you to move the entirety of your style into one direction than it being currently a mix of both, which isn't very ideal. So let's start with the higher order component improvements. My goal here is allow you to do much more with less code. So let's check it out. First, we have two higher order components in VeeValidate. We have the validation observer and the validation provider. Both of them now have a new property called as, which you can, it basically acts as if you are telling the provider, render something. So here we are telling the provider, render an input tag, a native HTML input tag. So what happens here is that the validation provider, since it is a higher order component that is declarative and lives in the template, it allows it to abstract away tons of stuff. For example, when you tell it render this input tag, you can also specify anything. You can specify a vtext field. If you are using Vuetify, you could specify something from Quasar framework, whatever you want. So here it's just a native input to keep it simple. And what the validation provider assumes is that what you are telling it to render must be an input field. So if it's an input field, it must emit some events. It must emit an input event, maybe, a change event, maybe, and maybe a model update event as well. So 3 events to watch out for, even maybe more. But yeah, there are some assumptions that can be made here. So what it does for you is that it binds those events to your rendered input, and it watches its value all under the hood without you having to worry about vmodel or anything like this. For the validation observer, it's slightly different, but it follows the same principle. When you tell it render something, it assumes you are telling it to render a forum or a forum component, like a VeeForum in Vuetify. And it assumes the following. So it must emit at least a submit event, right? So if it emits a submit event, it can do the following. So first, it validates all your inputs for you, and only if they are all valid, it will trigger your handler. Otherwise, it won't even trigger. So you no longer have to check if your form is valid, or you have to check if or to prevent submission before checking if your form is prevent submission before sending stuff to your API if you want to handle it with Ajax or whatever. It just does all of that for you. It validates your inputs, and only if they are valid, this onSubmit handler will only then be triggered. So we have also a minor improvement. Like you have seen before, we can access errors directly from the validation observer, which allows us to write much less validation providers. So the validation provider, as you can see now here, doesn't use scooped slots, which is the current case of V3. V3 scooped slots, you must specify which input you are going to render in the scooped slot, and you have to access the errors. And because you have no other way to access the errors, you always had to use the scooped slots. But since now you have access to your errors, you can skip using the scooped slots unless you really have to. So here I'm just rendering the errors directly from the validation observer. And this is a big improvement. And I think this is really like the game changer for VeeValidate. And although you guys won't even notice it happened because it's such a minor change, but internally it does a lot of stuff. So the validation provider, you could still use the scooped slot. say you want to render something really complex. It's not just a single node like an input text field. Maybe you're rendering a Bootstrap forum. Maybe you're rendering some complex object like we are going to see in a moment, some complex structure, I mean. So what vee-validate does now, it used to check, to search for your V models, and it would check which node has a V model and would validate that. But now it no longer does that. It will actually, instead of trying to guess which node to validate, it will ask you to specify for it, to hint it, in other words. And this can be done using the field binding object here. So it exposes a field object, you grab that field object, and you place it on your input with vbind. This allows vee-validate to be able to tell which input to validate, and it allows it to do all its stuff without you having to worry about what's happening under the hood. It just asks you for help now. So what does this field object contain? It contains some listeners, some attributes, and that's it. It's all that's required to run validation for vee-validate. So here is a complex example from V3 that never actually worked. We have here a menu, and from this is Vuetify's framework. Here we have an integration between the vtext field input and a date-picker input. And we have the validation observer wrapping everything up right here. So we want to validate if the user actually entered the date or something like this. So what we do is we have a problem here. I have told you before that V3 looks for your V models. How many V models do we have here? So I have highlighted them for you. We have actually 3. So which of them are our inputs? Okay, so let's go back. This V model is definitely not our input because it controls whether the menu is shown or not. This one, well, it looks like it's our input because it's bound to a text field and to update that item. So it makes sense, sure. What about date-picker component here? Yes, it might also be another input that we should validate as well because it's bound to the same value. But we were able to tell that because we are smart human beings. What if? But code isn't smart. Code is really dumb. So what it actually sees is this. So I have stripped away all the attributes from all our nodes and only left the V model because that's the only thing we are interested in. I have also removed all the tag names for the HTML nodes we had. So would you be able to tell now which of these V models are actually our inputs? Well, it's kind of hard right now, isn't it? So that's what the code currently sees, which is a problem. So it used to guess which one is it, which wasn't very ideal because that meant when you open the menu, it would trigger a re-render because it triggered the validation, which might trigger another re-render if the value is invalid, which means we have lots of unnecessary re-renders going on. And in some cases, which was quite recently, we had infinite render loops. It wouldn't stop rendering because this is triggering another rendering and it causes a validation to occur, then it triggers another validation, and so on, because all 3 models are confusing each other, are confusing the validation provider. It watches them all, but they have nothing to do with each other. So yes, it was kind of hard to tell the difference between them. In V3 currently, I have implemented a workaround for it, which it just takes the first V model and that's it, because fixing infinite loops was much more important than having accuracy when dealing with a complex structure like this. So in V4, this is completely avoided by using the field binding object. So all you have to do is grab your field object from here, from the validation provider scope the slot or slot props, or I don't know what they call it. So you grab it and you bind them directly on your inputs, and that's it. You have effectively told vee-validate which inputs to watch out for and which inputs to take care of, and it won't even have to do any unnecessary renders. That's entirely on your template. It's not about vee-validate. vee-validate now knows what to watch out for, so it's fixed in a way. You could still use vmodel, as you can see here. Okay, so we also have a minor improvement here is that if you are rendering a validation observer as a forum, it will automatically does a few things for you, like I previously mentioned. First, it will handle submissions by first checking if your fields are valid or not, triggering validation on each field, and if they are all valid, it will then trigger the submit event, dispatch it, so you can actually handle it here. And your submission handler here, so it means your submission handler here won't work until all the fields are valid. And your submission handler will receive all the values of the form directly. So, as you can see in this example, we didn't write a single model binding. And yeah, we have some fields here, but you won't have to, unless you really want to. So yeah, if you are building something really simple, you can get away with something really quick. And if you are building something complex, then it's business as usual. You won't change a lot. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the composition API. So composition API is something Gavin already mentioned it, but let me give you a quick intro to it. It's a new API that will change how we write Vue stuff forever, I guess. So it allows you to do stuff more imperatively than declaratively. So does this mean it has a paradox with VeeValidate? Since VeeValidate says it's a declarative declarative tool. Yes and no. So let's see how we can do this. First, we have UseField. It creates a validatable model for you. What does this mean? It means that let's go step by step here. We import UseField, and in our setup function, we define our field. So we give it a name, its name is email, and we give it some rules, which is a required and must be a valid email. Same things as previously with VeeValidate, same rule syntax, same everything. But we grab two properties from it. We grab a value property and an error message property. And we return them back to our template. So what happens here is that if we bind our input with the value property, whenever this value changes, it will be automatically validated for you, and the error message field will be populated for you as well. So this is all you can do. This is just what you have to do to get validation working with UseField. It's pretty simple. You might argue it's even better than the validation provider, but maybe, yeah. Let's check the other example here. So here is something slightly more complex. We have a basic registration form here with name and email and a password fields. And we want to create a form with it imperatively with UseForum. So UseForum is another function that you can use with UseField. So first, we call UseForum and we grab two properties from it. We grab forum object and a handle submit function. The forum object is a way to tell our inputs later on that they will be associated with this forum. And handle submit is a function that allows us to create a really handy submission handler for us that will do a lot of stuff automatically for us. So we'll get to that in just a second. So first, we define our name field. We give it a name of name, and it is required, and we send the forum object as its third parameter, which means it is associated now with this forum. And on the left side, we grab the name and the name errors from it. We kind of rename stuff because we have a couple of fields more here, so we can't all use the name value for our value. We have to change things a little bit. So we define the two fields in the same exact way. We define its name, we send them our rules. It is a password and it is required minimum of 8 characters, and it is associated with this forum. Same thing for email. And we grab the value, the validatable model, and the error message for it. And we create our submission handler using handle submit that we grabbed earlier, which what it does is that it validates the entire forum before triggering your callback here. So your callback here won't be triggered until every field is valid, and it will give you access to your values immediately. You don't have to check your name or password or value or email bindings again. It will send them for you automatically. So we return, and when you use it to bind it, when you use this handler on submit handler on a forum, you will automatically get all the benefits from the validation observer earlier. So it will prevent the submission for you, and it will validate everything for you and pass down the values in your callback. So yeah, it's the same thing, but in a different way. And that's it. That's how you do an entire forum with the UseField and UseForum, which are coming new in V4. So this brings us to the question. Now we have two ways to do validation. Which one to pick? The second way, being using the composition API, is really similar to what VeeValidate or other libraries might be doing right now at the moment. But I tried in VeeValidate's implementation to be as close as possible to the initial idea. It's revolving around not models, but around fields and forums. So it's gonna stick to that principle in a way or another. So let's go back to the question. Two ways to validate. Which one to pick? Well, again, it's the famous answer of it depends. It depends on the style you prefer, and it depends on your code. But I have wrote last week an article on that specific case where is there some cases where higher order components are superior than the validation within the composition API or not. So there are some cases actually, and I can boil them down for you. If you are building a component library, when you are building a custom input, text input component, for example, you would ideally use the composition API. But if you are building entire forms from another components, it would be better if you use the higher order components approach. So still, you can pick whatever you want. It's all up to you. Okay, I'm almost done. That brings us to the last feature we have. I implemented this actually last week, so let's see if it's actually good or not. So we have this thing called inline rules, which I will explain in a minute. First, how do we define rules in VeeValidate at the moment? We define them globally using extend function, which we import from VeeValidate, and we kind of define our rule, how our rule works, and that's pretty much it. But the problem with this is that since we define it globally, that means we have to define all our validation rules for the entire application in one place, meaning lazy loading rules isn't really an option here. And it would really make your app more confusing and would cause maybe some errors when you are building your forums. Some rule isn't available, stuff like this. So how do we get around this? Well, in V4 now you can define a function as your rules directly without having to import any rule from VeeValidate's built-in ones. So here is how we can do it with UseField. We import UseField from VeeValidate as usual, as from previous examples, I mean. And we define our field, which is called password. And instead of defining a rule string, which we used to call required by min8, for example, now we pass a function. That function will receive the value and can return a string, which will then be treated as the error message for the field, or at a Boolean, specifically true, which means the field has passed validation. And that allows us to do a lot of stuff here. So not only does this allow you to extract your rules to your own files or lazy load them even if you really want to, but this also opens the door for quite a few stuff. But first, we can do this with UseField, and you can do this with the validation provider as well. With the validation provider, all you have to do is pass your validation function to the rules prop up here. So this is our validation rule, and we bind it to our rules property right here. So this is all you need to get it to work with the validation provider. So both declarative and imperative approaches work really well here. And this really opens the door for something really interesting. So I think from after a few years now that allowing rules to be built in VeeValidate was a mistake from the beginning, because it really made maintaining everything was really hard for me, since I'm currently the only one working on it, I guess. There is, of course, help from awesome contributors from time to time, but it always meant that when I wanted to change something about a rule, I would have to break things in the core version, which meant well, I have to release a new release just to update a single rule, which isn't very ideal. So right now, the vee-validate built-in rules will be separated in its own package, so I can avoid that completely, and they will no longer be required to get anything to work. So in this example, we can use something really like battle tested, like Yup, which is a very popular validation library in the front-end world. So which is really nice, has this chainable API that's really nice. So first you define your validation rule. First, we import your stuff. You import UseField and you import Yup, or you can import some parts of Yup. So we start composing our validation rule, which is for a password field. So it's a string and it is required and it has a minimum character count of 8. But we have a problem here. Yup doesn't really treat validation the same way vee-validate does. First, it is asynchronous like vee-validate, so no problems here, but it throws errors whenever a field fails submission. So we have to take that into account. So we wrap the password validation from Yup into another function that we will call rules that will handle all these caveats for us. First, it will wait for the validation to happen, and once it happens, it will return the Boolean true. Unless something happened and we catch the error, it will pass down the error message to vee-validate. So it works really the same as if the previous example. So all we have to do is define our field and pass down our function that's adapted Yup into it. But that isn't very neat, right? That's a lot of code to get just one validation for one field going. So this brings us to another idea I have, which is we will be publishing some adapter libraries for popular validation frameworks like Yup. So you import UseField from VeeValidate and Yup, and you wrap something called a wrap function from at vee-validate/yup, which is another package. And this allows you to, if you like using Yup, you don't have to choose anymore. You can make vee-validate work with it directly. So we just call wrap, and you pass it the rule expression of Yup. You pass it whatever rule you composed, which is a string required minimum of 8 characters, and this will handle the conversion for you. It will convert it to something vee-validate can understand. The reason for this is that I didn't want vee-validate to be dependent on another library. For example, this is inspired from Formic. So Formic is a very popular React validation library, but it has Yup support built into it. So I didn't want to do that because that would mean there is a hidden dependency between vee-validate and Yup, which isn't very fair for anyone, because that means we have some code right there that probably want to be used by a lot of people. So it's unnecessary to include such an adapter out of the box, although it's really small code. But yeah, we don't want to support anything in a hidden way, to say the least. So if you're gonna use Yup, you're just gonna import your wrap function. And this is how you define the validator now. We defined a password validator. You could write it all in one line if you really want to, but I have done it here in 2 lines to make things a little bit easier to read. So this brings us to a bigger question. Previously we had from vee-validate beginning, and I think in most validation libraries now in Vue.js ecosystem, we have to define rules on the field level, which means for each field I have to define its rules, which was, well, kind of annoying maybe, because that would mean anyone would be maintaining your code would have to read the entire forum from the markup and would have to tell, okay, this is required, okay, this must be a valid email, and so on. But here we have something really new. We have something called a validation schema, which can be passed down to forums or to validation observers, or a UseForum function. So you can build a validation object for your entire field, so you don't have to define a validation rule for each of your fields. So we import a wrap schema here from the same adapter library we used before, and you give it a Yup schema. I have used Yup here, but you can use something really custom here. It all works the same. But just because Yup is more associated with building validation schemas, so I just used it to showcase it here. So we import wrap schema from our adapter function, and we define our schema and send it to our template after wrapping it right here. Here we send it to our template because we are in a setup function. So what happens here is that we assign it to our validation schema property. And the validation observer will automatically take this schema and use it for your fields. So you won't have to define rules for your fields. So this is it. This is how you write a validation field now. You just give it a name and you tell it what to render, and that's it, you are done. So, and remember that you don't have to use vmodels either. So this is what you see now is a full example for a forum. You don't have to write anything additional. Okay, so when is this going to be out? When it's ready? Yeah, I know we hear this a lot, but sadly the progress is currently really slow. I mean, I get a lot done, but it's not really consistent. So because I have other stuff to do, I have a full job and other stuff to take care of. So, but yeah, it's coming up very soon. So how you will know about it, you can check first the progress, the daily progress of it on the next branch. You can check the comments to see what I'm up to if you are really interested. You could check the discussions in the pull request I have opened for this branch. And I will probably release a new article on my blog detailing all the changes and maybe the reasoning behind it. So it can be really beneficial for anyone interested as well. This is it, guys, and thank you. This is all I have for today.